Hey, let's talk about some fractals. Again, I've been talking quite a lot about fractals on this channel somewhat recently, and I'm still really obsessed about the mathematics of fractals. I still find it a lovely thing to investigate. Some of you may be here because you saw me do a Numberphile video about some fractals, and in this video I want to talk sort of, maybe not a final time, but another time about how I build some of those fractals, and I'll build the Sierpinski tetrahedron, or the fractal tetrahedron fractal that I talk a lot about in the Numberphile video in this one. And I want to kind of upgrade the technique I've been using to build some fractals in relatively recent videos on this channel, because there's an even better way that's still going to use the chaos game. So that's what I want to get through in this. We treat it like a live GeoGebra build, but I'll also show you some of the other builds I've already done at the end to see where this goes. Quick reminder, you will remember maybe some videos from me on this channel or from Numberphile where I talk about the chaos game, and that's the idea which I'll put in a video over here where you take, in the original format, you take 3 dots and you take another dot and you move it towards one of those dots halfway towards them at random, and you repeat that. And in the Numberphile video I pointed out that that sort of random choice of direction is a bit of a misdirection. You don't need to choose randomly, you can just go to all 3. You end up creating a lot more points more quickly, which means it's harder to do by hand, but you create the structure. And if you're here, you probably remember what structure that is. It's a Sierpinski tetrahedron in the rules that I've just used. You create that structure a lot more quickly. So first thing is, if you want to make a fractal from the chaos game, it's much quicker to do it with starting with a point and then doing 3 points, or however many points you're going to use. And I talk about different options you have in the Numberphile video. You create that number of copies. So you're creating copies of an original thing, and you create them at a certain scale, and that's determined by how far away you move. So in the original chaos game, you move halfway towards one of the points. In fact, that's kind of like enlarging that point by a factor of a half. I appreciate it's not getting bigger, it's de-enlarging. An enlargement of by a factor of less than 1 is going to make it smaller. Now with a point, that doesn't really matter because it's still a point and actually just moves it. But it's worth remembering that if it wasn't just a point, then you'd get a scaled copy half the size. Yeah, hold that thought. So the chaos game originally starts with picking 1 point at random. I'm saying upgrade it by going all 3 points in that one, or however many points you've got. Get there quicker. You get exponential growth of points. But also useful to realize that you don't have to use a point to start with. If you knew what the structure was going to be, then you could create that whole structure and then enlarge it by a factor of a half. Basically make a scaled copy of the thing you're trying to make and move that to those points. And that kind of already feels like you've already got the fractal. It feels slightly backwards in that you need to know what you're going to get before you get it. But say, instead of using a point in the chaos game, you use the whole triangle and you enlarge that by a factor of half and it go to each of the points. Then you'd be making the first iteration of the Sierpinski gasket. And I hope that kind of makes sense. That's what I'm going to do in this one, is realize that you don't need to use just a point, in which case you create this point cloud which starts to approximate the fractal. If we're going to make a fractal out of triangles, why not start with the whole triangle? And actually I'm going to do this with the tetrahedron. I'm going to build the Sierpinski fractal tetrahedron because that's not one I've done on this channel yet. But instead of using the dots, and you'll see me use the dots in the Numberphile video, but I'm just going to use the whole tetrahedron and then start copying that. That's my plan. Okay, let's get into it. Okay, I have a blank GeoGebra window. I'm using GeoGebra Classic 5. I do find the other versions can do this. I'm going to use a command that's present in the other versions. They just seem to crash more often. Don't know what it is. We are going to crank up the capabilities here by creating lots of points. In this case, we're going to get lots of tetrahedrons. So actually it does seem to help to have a decent graphics card behind this, and you can very easily just lock up the program by trying to ask it to create too many thousands of points. So you have been warned, hey, it may even happen in my live build. First thing to notice though, I'm going to do this in 3D, so let's turn on the 3D graphics mode. I will use this graphics mode to have some sliders on, but maybe I'll just turn off the axes and what have you. And what am I going to do here? Well, I'm going to build a tetrahedron. There is a command to build a tetrahedron, but actually I'm going to not build it maybe with a flat base. I'm going to build it as if it's inside a cube for reasons that will become apparent later on. So let's just build a cube first of all. I'm going to use the cube command. I've found that it can deal with just 2 points. So if I'd use the origin and 1, 0, it makes a cube, a unit cube, and that's kind of my starting point. I want to start with a unit cube as my setup. And for reasons you will have noticed in the Numberphile video if you have watched that, I really think you should probably watch that first if you haven't done. I know that a tetrahedron will fit inside a cube. Maybe that's something you knew, maybe it's something you didn't. It's a nice fact if you ask me. And actually the edges of it will be along the diagonals of the faces. So I now can build a tetrahedron inside that cube. I can see the points I'm going to use. So let's build a tetrahedron. There is a command for tetrahedron. It wants an equilateral triangle or equivalently 3 points. Let's just see which points it wants. I'm going to use the origin. Going to use the opposite corner to that, which I think is the point. Oh, I'm going to make them 3-dimensional. Otherwise it might get confused later on. So the point 1, 1, 0 is the opposite corner. And it has made a tetrahedron, but I want it to not be in that orientation. So I'm going to give it another point on the tetrahedron. It looks like they're labeled F or D there. So I'm just going to call it F. Does that do what I want? I think that does what I want. I'm not quite sure how it gets the tetrahedron from the 3 points, but this is good enough. Let's hit return and move this around. I can see that has made a tetrahedron which fits nicely inside my cube. So I'm happy with that. Again, I didn't really know how that command worked, but if I turn off the cube, I've just got a tetrahedron. Got those floating points there still. The B and the E I don't need. Incidentally, it's worth pointing out they are auxiliary objects. They were kind of made by GeoGebra when I made the cube by one command. So they're not showing up on my algebra view, but they will show up if you turn on auxiliary objects. And then it's really helpful to sort these by their type. You can do that here, sort by, at the moment they're in the construction order, sort by object type, and it says the points go together, the quadrilaterals go together. So actually I'm just going to hide most of the points, turn them off, and you can see it's turned some of the edges on. Some of the edges are along the flat plane, that's why they're showing up on the graphics view here. What I could probably do is select the tetrahedron and just say only make that visible on the 3D graphics view, and then it won't turn up on the 2D, except it still will because that's one of the edges. Let's select all these segments and just make them not visible on graphics 1. Now it's gone, fine. So there's my tetrahedron. That is the basic idea. The point I'm trying to make in this video is make a fractal tetrahedron, and the point is that I made in Numberphile is that 4 points, spoiler, they're the corners of the tetrahedron. If you did the chaos game with 4 points and moved a starting position halfway towards those points, you will eventually create a fractal tetrahedron. So my plan is, if I have a tetrahedron and I enlarge it by a scale factor of 1/2 towards each of those 4 points, I will create the first iteration of a fractal tetrahedron. And then if I can iterate that process, you take all of those tetrahedrons and make them go halfway towards all the points. Even though it's slightly surprising that it slots them all in the right places, I'll let you have a think about it. It is going to make a tetrahedron scaled version of this fractal tetrahedron. You'll see what I mean when I do it. I do think I'm going to need some of those points back on, so let's bring and yeah, the origin's gone. Let's call the origin O. It never turned up because I typed it in cold. It's turned up there. I don't really want to show it, but O, and then A is the point 1, 1 over there. So well, maybe I'll turn these on for the moment. And I think it was F and D. Those are the corners of the tetrahedron. So those are the points I want to work with. In fact, I wonder. Well, I can just make a list of them. Let's just leave that as the names I need. First thing I want to do, and this is what the other videos in my channel will help you do, is I want to start a sort of a practice iteration. It really helps before you use the iteration command to get sort of manually typed in how this command is going to work. So let me just do that. I'm going to enlarge the tetrahedron, which is called B, by a factor of 0.5 towards one of the points. Let's go with O. There it is, and you can see it's done it down there. That's just me checking a sense check. I don't actually want to do that. I wanted to do it for all 4 corners, so let's delete that. By the way, you can always get a recent command by pressing up or down on the arrow keys for the input bar. Mine's down because I put the input bar at the top, but if your input bar is at the bottom, you have to press up. Sorry, deal with it. I wanted to do it for all 4 corners, so I'm going to use a zip command. Zip, and then the command I'm going to zip through a list, enlarge the original tetrahedron B by 0.5 towards the point P, but I haven't got a point P. That's going to be the point it's going to get from my list. The zip command is looking for P from the list, and let's just type the list in. O, A, D, and F, I think I said. And you can see them arriving there. It's previewing my command. I press return, and it's made 4 copies of that tetrahedron, and you can already see the structure emerging. So this is promising. In one command, I've done the next iteration. What you'll notice though is that there is a list. That zip command has made me a list. What I need to do now is type in another command that takes that list, which has 4 tetrahedrons in it, runs through it, and does that command again on each of those tetrahedrons. So let's do the next level, I need to zip through that list. So let's get the command I just did was that one. Let's zip through that list. But this time I don't want you to take P. I don't want to use B. I want to use a tetrahedron. Let's call it T. But the T comes from the previous one I've just done. So L1, that list I've just made. It does look like it's doing it. Let me just talk through the sanity here. I've got an enlargement of a tetrahedron by a factor of half to a point, and the points are going those 4 original corner points. But the tetrahedron I want to run through a list from L1, which is the first iteration thing I've done. So that's now done the second iteration. But the catch here, and the reason I do a practice, by the way, I'm going to turn off the original tetrahedron to see what's going on here. And I can turn off the second list, the L1 list, and you see that my M1, it's called it M1 because it looks like a matrix in its double listing thing. But anyway, that is the second iteration of copying the tetrahedron around. I'll deal with how it looks better in a moment. The problem is it's a list of lists, so actually it's a list of lists of tetrahedrons, and I just want it to just be one list, so I'm just going to flatten that list. And I'm doing these practice commands, so I've got one command I can put into my iteration command. That won't change how it looks, but that list is now just a list of tetrahedrons without the double brace there. I think we're ready. So that was my practice. I actually don't want that one, and I can delete it later on. My original list is fine. I don't want that either. Let's put the original tetrahedron back on, and we're going to do it. So I'm going to grab that command I just made, although I typed in flatten, and I want to iterate this. Now I'm going to have to make a couple of changes, but first of all, if I type iteration, I don't want an iteration list because actually I don't need all the steps. I just need the final step, which is going to be how many times it's done this thing. So it's not iteration list, it's iteration. I want it to do an expression, and now that expression is outside, so let's just delete all of that rubbish. Well, maybe it's helpful if I just copy that and see how this structure of command works. I have talked about this in other videos, but it is a complicated command. It needs an expression to iterate. I'm going to put what I just typed in there, but then it needs a variable to iterate, and so I have to go back and change something. What I want to do is leave that command alone, except for the fact that I don't want it to grab the tetrahedrons from the list L1. I want it to grab it from a list which I haven't told it yet, and that's the list which I want to iterate, because every time it gets a new one, it gives me a new list of tetrahedrons, just like the M1 list was another list of tetrahedrons. So I'm going to call these lists T's. You grab a tetrahedron from a tetrahedron list called T's, and that's the variable I'll iterate. So let's say T's starts with a list, and you have to put a list of values in here. So I need a list of tetrahedrons, but the very first list is just one tetrahedron, so it's a list B. Now I haven't set up a slider for how many times to do this, so I'm just going to do it twice, and I'll change that for an N in a moment. That is the moment of truth. It did what I wanted. Believe me, that command can get messy, and debugging that is a painful thing. It's not really designed for this level of command, but it did work, and I think if we make a slider for N, we'll be able to put a slider in and make it do that. Do not let this slider go very high at first. I'm going to let it go to 4, and even that might scare the computer. I am going to let it go to 0 as well, because we could have 0 iterations on this thing. And let's change the command I just made, and instead of having the 2 at the end, I'll put an N in. N is currently 1, and it has changed it to the first iteration. If I go to 0, I get the original tetrahedron. Let's pleased about that. Let's turn off the original tetrahedron so we don't get a double plot. That is the iterated tetrahedron, iterated 0 times, and this is the moment of truth. One iteration. Should we leave this spinning while I do it? Let's leave it spinning. Nice little spin button up there. One iteration, 2 iterations, 3 iterations, 4 iterations. Just about coped. I think it might cope with 5. I suspect 6 would really slow things down. Hey, do it on your own computer, and just save it now before you crank it up, because if you go too high, it will just sit and chug for a while, and you might not get that file back. And if you haven't saved it, you have lost it. You have been warned. You can tell how many times that's happened to me, can't you? We have built a fractal tetrahedron controlled by one slider, and it's not building it out of dots, it's building it out of tetrahedrons. I really like this. I feel like I should have done this for some of the other videos. So, or the thing when I made the Sierpinski triangle, Sierpinski gasket, and the Mengus carpet, the Sierpinski carpet, I did it by calculating corners of triangles and using that. This would have been a cleaner way to do it. not going to remake those videos just yet. I do want to talk a little bit more about the other fractals in the Numberphile video, but before we do that, let's stop the spinning and deal with some cosmetics. First of all, because they are transparent, you can see all these dotted lines knocking around. I'm just going to select this object. This is the only object I'm displaying. I'm going to make it opaque. There's a shortcut slider here. You could just right click on the properties and do it. And now we have a little bit more solid looking. Maybe that's the wrong color. Let's get a brighter color. Maybe it's red. There we go. And there's the fractal tetrahedron, which still increases in detail. I think my computer can cope with 4. These two I don't really want here, so let's get all the points and make them not appear on the graphics view, only in the 3D view. And this is a lovely object to explore. You can zoom in and move it around. If you've got it up to level 5 or level 6, it will look very intricate indeed. I think maybe it's going to look nicer if I go to level 5. Let's try level 5. If I have to if the video stops at this point, you know why it's gone wrong. It is taking a while. I tapped right on the keyboard, so it should have done it. I think I'm just waiting. It's done it. It's there. So once it's done it, it seems like GeoGebra can cope fine, and I can drag this screen around. It doesn't seem to be processing too hard. Well done, GeoGebra, but it does take a time to do it. And the line thickness is beginning to be a problem. Now, one thing before I change the line thickness, which you can change, if I was going to 3D print that, it's a weird structure to try and 3D print, but I think I might need quite a thick line for it to have some substance at those infinitely thin joins. I need to sort of fake this thickness there. So having a thickness of line, you can export STL files from GeoGebra Classic 6, not Classic 5, which I'm using, and that's annoying. Don't get me started. I'll talk about that in another video, perhaps about 3D printing from GeoGebra. But hey, if you can build this in GeoGebra, then you can 3D print it, and I really like that. I am going to make the line thickness smaller, so this object, right click. You can do this in a shortcut, by the way, but I'll just do it from the menu now. Style, line thickness, let's go right. I can go to 0, and you'll see that this is now looking very ephemeral indeed, but there's no lines on these objects. They're just tetrahedrons, and you begin to actually see some of the lovely things I talk about in the video, which is if you get the angle right, this just becomes a square. And actually, because of the way I've built it in the cube like I did, there are some view commands in GeoGebra. These 3 view it from the principal directions, the axes. So you could view towards the XY plane, the XY plane. If I do that, it's a square. If I do it from the side, it's a square. If I do it from the other side, it's a square. And you can always click this one to go back to the home view. That's really useful to have those default views. If you built the tetrahedron in this orientation, then they're there for you. So there's the glimpses of why this is an imaginary cube, and that's the kind of goal of this video. I really like that clean way of building the fractal from the tetrahedrons, and you can apply that method to 2-dimensional shapes and stuff if you like that method better. It's taken me a while to get used to how to sort of implement the iteration commands in ways that I don't get really angry about. So doing those practice commands to get the first couple of levels, and then making it work on a list and flattening that list before I go for the full thing, has really helped me do it consistently. Before I leave this entirely, I would like just to remind ourselves that why this one is a particularly interesting fractal, and why it has these properties that if you look at it from the right perspective, it does look flat. And it's because it has a fractal dimension of 2, and in some perspectives you can see it behaving just like an area rather than a 3-dimensional shape. And that's kind of where I went in the Numberphile video. I'd like to look at some other fractals, though, as I just said, which Hideki Suiki, who I had a chat with before I made the Numberphile video, he calls imaginary cubes, because they have a same property that if you look at it from the directions that you look at a cube to see a square, you see a square. So they're kind of like cubes, except if you look at them from other directions, they don't look like cubes. It's slightly surprising that they exist, and what he did was 3D print this one and a couple of others that he found. So let's talk about how I'd model those. And you will have seen them in the Numberphile video, but seeing them in a 3D modeling package like GeoGebra, or if you put it into Blender or something, actually means you can see it much better than holding one that's been printed, because when you print it, you're going to have to put these little supports in to hold some of the structure together, which you may have noticed on the video. So let's make some of them. I want to show you something that Hideki Suiki noticed, and was actually made into a lovely video by Ben Gobler. I don't know if I'm saying your name right, Ben, I'm sorry. I noticed that Ben made this video as part of the Summer of Math Exposition, that summer project that Grant Sanderson of 3 Blue 1 Brown suggested, is that, you know, go and make a nice math video, according to them, and submit it on YouTube, just because the world would be better if there were more of them. And what's resulted is then lots of excellent videos turn up on YouTube about math, lovely stuff. Ben made a lovely one about Hideki's ideas of these imaginary cubes. I think it's a lovely video, Ben, well done. Hideki, I think your ideas are lovely too about the original things here. So the idea is that a Latin square is surprisingly helpful to think about when you're thinking of an imaginary cube. And if you're not sure what a Latin square is, a game of Sudoku is a Latin square. It's where the numbers in a column and rows of a square are unique, like they don't repeat it, and so every column and every row have a unique set of numbers. And here is a very basic Latin square. It's almost an insulting one. I'm putting it in a bracket because those of you who've ever studied matrices know this is also a matrix. This is Latin square because in that top row you've got a 1 and a 2, and the bottom row you've got a 1 and a 2 in the other order, and the top column you've got 1 and 2. Sorry, the left column and the right column you've got a 1 and a 2. Maybe it's not a surprise. It wouldn't be a Latin square, for example, if you'd done this, because numbers get duplicated. Whatever. You could do one with 3 numbers in. Let's just try 1, 2, 1, 3. I'm not doing these at random. You'll see why they've turned up. Let's try 1, 2, 3. No, that doesn't work. It has to be 1, 3, 2 to make that work. And then I think it has to be 3 and a 2 and a 1. That is a Latin square with 3 numbers done in it. But there's more than one, so let me just write another one of those down. Another one might be, if I start with the same top row, 2, 1, 3, 3, 2, 1, I think it would have to be that, and then you'd have to have a 1 and a 3 and a 2, and that is another Latin square, and it's different in some sense. I've written these 3, although they are not the only ones I could have written to achieve my purposes, because these are useful for imaginary cubes if you imagine those being the heights of some points in a square grid. And what you realise, because those all heights are along a row and a column, you would have all the possible heights along each row or column, and it would fill the square if you looked from the side. I could try and explain this with more hand wavy, but I'm just going to use these Latin squares to build a shape in GeoGebra, and you'll see what I mean. If you want a better explanation, Ben's video is lovely. So these Latin squares, let's put them in GeoGebra. Okay, we're back in GeoGebra, and there's some points on the screen. I'll explain what they're doing in a minute. Here's the Latin square that I initially showed you, because it only has unique 1s and 2s in each row and column. And I've turned that into 3-dimensional points. You can imagine if you look down on this Latin square, stop spinning, each grid point, this dot is representing a number, and actually the numbers in the Latin square here I've turned into the height of these points. So that point's at height 1, that point's at height 2, and so on and so forth. And you can see, if you're paying attention, that is making a tetrahedron corner-y shape. And that's what this, like any matrix will do, could represent some heights in 3 dimensions. So all I've done is I've turned this into these points, which mean that actually from each direction you can see it happening already. If I look from the top, you get a square, and if I look from the side, you get a square, and you look from the other side, you get a square. So there's a clue about how Latin square describes an imaginary cube. As long as the numbers in the rows and the columns are unique, then you'll cover all the options. And I've started with a square matrix, so looking down is also going to be square. Let me put that cube in place, and what I've done next is I've used the points that I've made. You can see those points that sort of are still lurking there. I've used them as the corners of the fractal process that I talked about earlier, and I'll copy this cube at the correct scale factor towards those points, and I'll do that once, and you can see that this is a little representation of my Latin square, if you like, with cubes instead of the points. So you can see that there's a cube at height 1, and then at height 2 and 2 and 1, and it's kind of like a spun down version of my Latin square. Now once I realise I can do that once, you see it's still an imaginary cube. Let's just check. There it is. Yeah, these directions still let you see a square because I'm building it out of cubes. But that means I can keep going. And what I'm doing is I'm replacing a cube with another Latin square copy of that cube, which will be an imaginary cube, and therefore the entire cube will still be an imaginary cube. And I've just done it with the same process, the fractal iteration that I showed in the tetrahedron, but I'm iterating the cube this time and sending them towards each of those points. Let's do another version, and you see each of those is turned into its own little copy, and I'm beginning to build what feels more fractally, this time out of cubes and not tetrahedra, but I hope you recognise this is going to end up with the same fractal. So let's just crank this up now. I'm going to go up to 4. And you see this is making the fractal tetrahedron, the Sierpinski tetrahedron, if you like, that sort of thing. It's made them out of little cubes, but hey, that's just as valid as making them out of little dots, which I did with the Chaos game. As long as you've got enough of them, it starts to not matter what you're making it from. It's nice to see the cube structure emerging, or rather the tetrahedron structure emerging from the cubes. And you can see that this is built on that Latin square. So the question remains now, if I use those other Latin squares, or indeed any Latin square, what shapes will we get? Let's have a look. So here's another Latin square, the second Latin square I wrote down, a 3x3 one this time. And you can see I've turned this into the points in the same way. And if I just get the right orientation, I think that's the right orientation. If I look down, there's the 3x3 grid. But you can see the heights. There's this one at a height 2, that one down at a height 1, and that one at height 3. And that's the top row, you can see. Really hard to see unless you move it around to check the three-dimensionality of this. So that's just a representation of the Latin square. Let's put a cube on again. And what we'll do is we'll iterate that cube towards each of those points. This time we'll do a third of the size because it's a 3x3 grid, and let's do that straight away. And you can see that that Latin square immediately turns into this imaginary cube, and those cubes in this mix are representing the heights in this nice matrix here. But it means we can carry on. As long as you replace one of those cubes with the same Latin square sort of derivation, we'd get this next. And these are still imaginary cubes. Let's just check. I haven't checked it for the basic ones, but if I look down from the top, of course I get a square. If I look from the side, still a square. From the other side, still a square. And what is this shape? It's not a tetrahedron. This is a different fractal. Let's turn off those points, which are distracting me now, and crank up the iterations. I wonder how far I can go without this going a bit odd. So there's 3 iterations. You can already see the structure emerging, and actually there's these big gaps. There's a big layer of nothingness. You can see a triangle on this side, which is kind of nice, with a nice fractal sort of cross section to it. But you may have seen this fractal in the Numberphile video, but it had some supports connecting it all together just to hold the 3D print together. At least in this version, you can see it without the supports, which are not part of the fractal. I'm going to try going up one more. I suspect it might have a complaint to make because it's doing 9 to the power 4 instead of 9. Like suddenly we've got a lot more not more cubes that GeoGebra needs to process here. So I'm just going to give it a chance. I might even cut the video if it takes that long. No, I killed it. I think it's big. Oh, it's done it. I was about to announce the death of my version of GeoGebra. It has done it. I wonder if we can zoom in and see this a bit more closely. Everything is running slowly now, but it will let me drag it around. You can see the detail is getting super fine, so I'm kind of losing the fact that it's built of cubes now, and I start to see the structure of the fractal, which has got these sort of sandwichy layers. They're not really sandwichy layers. They seem to be in pairs of layers. And you see that there's a sort of outer pair, and then each of the layers inside has got a pair as well, which is how fractals work. This is what Hideki Suiki called the T fractal, because it's coming from a triangular antiprismoid. And actually, if you watch the extra Numberphile footage, I showed the original shape which those points would have made. Not a cube, a triangular antiprismoid, I think. It has a triangular flavour to it, definitely. I also think T is Hideki's surname's starting letter, so he chose that wisely. Let's look at the other Latin square and see what that one does. I'm going to close this one down because it's probably hogging a lot of memory. Before we close it, let's just check it's still an imaginary cube. From that side, a square. From that side, a square. And from that side, oh, so good. So here's the final Latin square I wrote down, and the final one that Hideki made some comments about in his paper. It looks similar. I can't even remember what's different about it. Like the numbers in the second 2 rows are different. Let's just check. If I put the coordinates on here, you can see them spread around in a different way. They feel a bit more symmetrical around the cube. Maybe if I hide the cube, you'll see it better. And let's just check this is doing what the Latin square is doing. There's the square, and it's 2, 1. Ooh, what's it doing here? Looks like I've done it somehow the other way round for this one. I'm not quite sure how that's happened. Let's just check an orientation that does work. So I think this way round makes sense of it. 2, 1, 3 are the heights of that top row, and then 3, 2, 1 down that diagonal line, and then 1, 3, 2. So it is the same. I don't know why it's spun around. However, if I put the cube back on and start cranking up the iteration, again, I'm going to iterate it a third copy towards each of those points. And we get this structure, which does feel much more symmetrical. You can see that sort of layer in the middle with 2 sort of floating cubes over there. It's very different feel to the other one, despite it looking like a very similar Latin square. And the structure really emerges if you crank it up a bit. You can see this starting to have a sort of axis down the middle, and then a big sort of flat plane across that bit. I think we can go one more without causing too much damage. It's still thinking pretty hard. There we go. That's the third iteration, and this is the H fractal that Hideki refers to. H being the first letter of his first name. Nice work, Hideki. And it's got a hexagonal flavour to it. Like, there's the hexagonal flavour. I'm going to turn off the points, which is distracting me as well, and we'll just have a look at this thing. I don't think this is easy to see in the printed model because there were some supports to hold it all together that you can't really cut out. And actually, I've got a version here. You can see that if we can get this focused on here, you can see that when you first print this, there's lots of structural supports to hold this together. That you can cut away some of them to create this thing, but each little sort of flower thing here, you need to hold together somehow. Let's just check this is an imaginary cube. I think that we can check from the top. It feels like it has to be because I've made it from that square, but from the side definitely, and the other side definitely. And what's more, on this one there are some other angles where it works, so I think I can put all of these vectors on. I think there are 6 of them. Let's go through all 3 of them. So here's one we've seen, here's another one we've seen, and here's another one we've seen, but the ones we haven't seen yet kind of give me a sort of oblique version of the square. So there are in fact 6 directions where this looks like a square. It's somehow got more imaginary cube status than the other one, and that's quite pleasing. It is a very nice thing. I'm going to try and crank it up to the next one and we'll see how long this takes. It's done it. It caught me by surprise. I don't know if it's draggable. Yeah, there it is. And now the structure is beginning to feel very emergent. I can zoom in. Let's see how. It's when you lose the axes. When I zoomed in here, it's actually quite hard to keep your bearings on this. But here is the fractal structure of this shape, and you can see how different it looks to the printed copy. I'll hold this one up again. Let's see if we can get that focused. You can see all the supports on this one. The structure is there, but without the supports, it's much more symmetrical, whereas the supports have to sort of add a one-sidedness to hold it all together. So this is the H fractal that Hideki talks about, and it is an imaginary cube, and this time it's got 6 directions where you see the actual square shape. Now, Hideki's done a bunch of work on what other views give you fractal images, or non-zero fractal images, or shapes with dimension which are non-trivial. And it's not just that when they sort of fill space, it's also when they make other nice shapes. So if you want to go technical detail, then look up Hideki's paper, and I think the second Numberphile video also references that. We are back in GeoGebra looking at the tetrahedron I made here. Obviously, if I was going to make a sort of file to share with people, I would do a bit more cosmetic stuff. I might make the background black and things like that to make this. But the principle, the work done is here already. The rest is just cosmetic. I might close the algebra view and things like that, so I'm not distracted by all that. Hiding a bunch of the auxiliary objects again might make it sort of have to think less hard about all the objects in there. And there's a bunch of objects that I made as sort of practice runs. I could just delete them too, because when it comes down to it, this is processing a lot of objects, and you want to sort of help it as much as you can by not letting it think too hard about things you don't need. But the idea of building these fractals in GeoGebra is very pleasing, and the fact that there's a command to do it almost in one line I find very satisfying. Before I finish this video though, I will hold up the 3D prints that Hideki has had made of these things. So when you get them from him, you can have a look at that. They come in a little box here. Let's see if we can get this to focus. So with the light on here, it's kind of hard to stop it reflecting too much, but you can see that if you get this from the right direction, suddenly the light blinds you, but also the fractal structure disappears and you get that square. So the first one there is the Sierpinski tetrahedron in a nice box. Let's get another one. This one is the T fractal. You can see again there's that big support down the middle that's not there in the real thing, but you need to sort of print it like that to hold it together. The nature of mathematical reality and real reality in 3D printers. And the H fractal here, you can see the supports really clearly here. I haven't put this one in the box because I haven't cut these supports off, but the one we played with on Numberphile, I've cut the big supports off here. So you can see it does look like it's sort of oriented in this sort of flower arrangement thing, because that's all the supports underneath holding this together. They don't exist in the actual fractal, so the mathematical fractal version and the 3D printed version again looking quite different. But it is nice to realise that you can make them in reality, and 3D printing is a wonderful thing, but the mathematical reality is this sort of abstract idea that we can conceive of even if we could never build it, because these things aren't connected. I hope you've enjoyed this. I really like the way of making fractals in GeoGebra. It gives you a sense of like organic building it, and also then lets you play around with it as a 3D object. Maybe in another video I'll talk about how you can get some 3D prints out of GeoGebra, but that's for another time. See you then.